Of Mice and Men, Chapter 2. The bunkhouse was a long, regular building. Inside, the walls were whitewashed and the floor unpainted. In 3 walls, there were small, square windows, and in the 4th, a solid door with a wooden latch. Against the walls were 8 bunks, 5 of them made up with blankets, and the other 3 showing their burlap ticking. Over each bunk, there was nailed an apple box with the opening forward so that it made 2 shelves for personal belongings of the occupant of the bunk. And these shelves were loaded with little articles, soap and talcum powder, razors, and those Western magazines ranchmen love to read and scoff at and secretly believe. And there were medicines in the shelves, and little vials, tomes, and from the nails on the box sides a few neckties. Near one wall there was a black cast-iron stove, its stovepipe going straight up through the ceiling. In the middle of the room stood a big square table littered with playing cards, and around it were grouped boxes for players to sit on. At about 10 o'clock in the morning, the sun threw a bright, dust-laden bar through one of the windows, and in and out of the beams flies shot like rushing stars. The wooden latch raised. The door opened, and a tall, stoop-shouldered old man came in. He was dressed in blue jeans, and he carried a big push-broom in his left hand. Behind him came George, and behind George, Lenny. "Well, the boss was expecting you last night," the old man said. "He was sore as hell you weren't here to go out this morning." He pointed with his right arm, and out of the sleeve came a round stick-like wrist, but no hand. "You can have them 2 beds there," he said, indicating the 2 bunks near the stove. George stepped over and threw his blankets down the burlap sack of straw that was a mattress. He looked into the box shelf, and then picked a small yellow can from it. "Say, what the hell's this?" "Oh, I don't know," says the old man. "Says positively kills lice, roaches, and other scourges. What the hell kind of bed you giving us anyways? We don't want no pants rabbits." That would be ticks or whatnot. The old swamper shifted his broom and held it between his elbow and his side, where he held out his hand for the can. He studied the label carefully. "Oh, I'll tell you what. Last guy that had this bed was a blacksmith. Hell of a nice fella. And clean as a guy you ever want to meet. Used to wash his hands even after he ate." "And how come he got graybacks?" George was working up a slow anger. Lenny put his bindle in the neighboring bunk and sat down. He watched George with an open mouth. "Well, tell you what. This here blacksmith, name of Whitey, was the kind of guy who would put that stuff around even if there wasn't no buds, just to make sure, see? Tell you what he used to do. At meals, he used to peel his boiling potatoes, and he'd take out every spot, no matter what kind, before he'd eat it. And if there was a red splotch on an egg, he'd scrape it off. Finally quit about the food. That's the kind of guy he was, clean. Used to dress up Sundays even when he wasn't going no place. Put on a necktie even. Then sat in the bunkhouse." "I ain't so sure," said George skeptically. "What'd you say he quit for?" The old man put the yellow can in his pocket. He rubbed his bristly white whiskers with his knuckles. "Why, he just quit. The way a guy will. Says it was the food. Just wanted to move. Didn't give no other reason but the food. Just says, 'Give me my time,' one night, the way any guy would." George lifted his tick and looked underneath it. He leaned over and inspected the sacking closely. Immediately, Lenny got up and did the same with his bed. Finally, George seemed satisfied. He unrolled his bindle and put things on the shelf. His razor, a bar of soap, his comb, and a bottle of pills, his liniment, and his leather wristband. Then he made up his bed neatly with blankets. The old man said, "I guess the boss will be out here in a minute. He was sure burned when you wasn't here this morning. Come right in when he was eating breakfast and says, 'Where the hell's that nude man?' And he gave the stable buck hell, too." George patted the wrinkle out of his bed and sat down. "Gave the stable buck hell?" he asked. "Sure, stable buck's and in here you will see the N-word. I will not say it. It's the one word that I will not say throughout all the books that I read. So, just so you're aware, the way that Steinbeck uses this, he wants you to kind of connect to George and Lenny, and you're going to realize that after George says the word once in making sure, I guess, that Candy said what he said, they don't say it ever again. Candy does. Well, he's old. He's in his 70s or 80s, and I mean, this is 1920s and the early 1930s, so he doesn't know any better yet. There isn't a better yet to know. At the time this book is taking place, the Harlem Renaissance is in full swing over in New York City, and the concept of African American is being created. So all they know is what they know. Unfortunately, that brings up this part in this book. Huh? Yeah, nice fella too. Kind of crooked back where a horse kicked him. The boss gives him hell when he's mad, but the stable butt don't give a damn about that. He reads a lot. He got books in his room. What kind of guy is the boss? George asked. Well, he's a pretty nice fella. Gets pretty mad sometimes, but he's pretty nice. Tell you what. Know what he done on Christmas? Brought a gallon of whiskey right here and says, drink hearty, boys. Christmas comes but once a year. The hell he did. Whole gallon? Yes, sir. Jesus, we had fun. They let him come in that night. Little Skinner, name of Smitty, took after him. Done pretty good, too. The guys wouldn't let him use his feet, so he got him. And if he could have used his feet, Smitty says he could have killed him. The guys said on account that he's got a crooked bat, Smitty can't use his feet. He paused on a relish of the memory. And after that, the guys went into Soledad and raised hell. I didn't go in there, though. I ain't got the poop no more. Lenny was just finished making the bed. The wooden latch raised again and the door opened. A little stocky man stood in the open doorway. He wore blue jean trousers, a flannel shirt, a black unbuttoned vest, and a black coat. His thumbs were stuck into his belt on each side of the square steel buckle. On his head was a boiled Stetson hat, and he wore high-heeled boots with spurs to prove he was not a laboring man. The old swamper looked quickly at him, and then shuffled to the door, rubbing his whiskers with his knuckles as he went. Them guys just come, he said, and shuffled past the boss and out of the door. The boss stepped into the room with the short, quick steps of a fat-legged man. I wrote Murray and Reddy that I wanted 2 men this morning. You got your work slips? George reached into his pocket and produced the slips and handed them to the boss. No, it wasn't Murray and Reddy's fault. It says right here in that slip that you'd be here for work this morning. George looked down at his feet. No, the bus driver gave us a bum steer, he said. We had to walk 10 miles. Says we was here when we wasn't. We couldn't get no rides in the morning. The boss squinted his eyes. Well, I had to send out the grain team short 2 buckers. Wouldn't do any good to go out there now till after dinner. He picked his time book out of a pocket and opened it for the pencil was stuck between the leaves. George scowled meanly at Lenny, and Lenny nodded to show that he understood. The boss licked his pencil. What's your name? George Milton. And what's yours? Well, his name's Lenny Small. The names are entered into the book. Let's see. This is the 20th. Noon the 20th. Closed the book. Where you boys been working? No, up around weed, he said said George. You too? To Lenny. Yeah, him too, said George. The boss pointed a playful finger at Lenny. He ain't much of a talker, is he? Nah, he ain't, but he's sure as hell a good worker, strong as a bull. Lenny smiled to himself. Strong as a bull, he repeated. George scowled at him, and Lenny dropped his head in shame at having forgotten. The boss said suddenly, Listen, Small. Lenny raised his head. What can you do? In a panic, Lenny looked at George for help. Oh, you can do anything you tell him, said George. He's a good skinner. He can wrestle grain bads, drive a cultivator. He can do anything. Just give him a try. The boss turned on George. Then why don't you let him answer? What are you trying to pull it over? George broke in loudly. Well, I'm saying he's bright. He ain't, but I say he's a goddamn good worker. He can put up a 400-pound bale. The boss deliberately put the little book into his pocket. He hooked his thumbs into his belt, and squinted over one eye, nearly closed. Say, what are you selling? Huh? I said, what's the stake you got in this guy? You taking his paycheck away from him? No, of course I ain't. Why do you think I'm selling him out? Well, I ain't never seen one guy take so much trouble for another guy. I just like to know what your interest is. George said, he's my cousin. I told his old lady I'd take care of him. He got kicked in the head by a horse when he was a kid. He's all right, just ain't bright. You can do anything you tell him. The boss turned halfway. Well, God knows you don't need no brains to buck barley bads. But don't you try to pull nothing over. Milton, I got my eye on you. Why'd you quit and weed? Job was done, said George promptly. What kind of job? He was digging a cesspool. All right. Don't try to put nothing over, because you can't get away with nothing. I seen wise guys before go out with the grain teams after dinner, and go on out at the grain teams after dinner. They're picking up barley at the threshing machine. Go out with Slim's team. Slim? Yeah, big tall Skinner. You'll see him at dinner. He turned abruptly and went to the door. But before he turned and looked for a long moment at the two men. When the sound of his footsteps had died away, George turned on Lenny. So you wasn't gonna say a word. You was gonna leave your big flapper shut and leave me doing the talking. Damn near lost us this job. Lenny stared hopelessly at his hands. I forgot, George. Yeah, you forgot. You always forget. And I gotta talk you out of it. He sat down heavily on the bunk. Now he's got his eye on us. Now we gotta be careful and make up no slips. You keep your big flapper shut after this. He fell morosely silent. George? What do you want now? I wasn't kicked in the head with no horse, was it, George? Be a damn good thing if you was, George said viciously. Save everybody a hell of a lot of trouble. You said I was your cousin, George. Yeah, well, that was a lie. I'm damn glad it was. If I was a relative of yours, I'd shoot myself. He stopped suddenly, stepped into the open front door, and peered out. Say, what the hell are you doing listening? The old man came slowly into the room. He had his broom in his hand, and at his heels there was a drag-footed sheepdog, gray of muzzle, and with pale, blind old eyes. The dog struggled lamely to the side of the room and lay down, grunting softly to himself and licking his grizzled, moth-eaten coat. The swamper watched him until he was settled. I wasn't listening. I was just standing out in the shade a minute, scratching my dog. Now I just finished swamping out the wash house. Yeah, he was poking your big ears in our business, George said. I don't like nobody getting nosy. The old man looked uneasily from George to Lenny and then back. I just come there, he said. I didn't hear nothing you guys are saying. I ain't interested in nothing you're saying. The guy on the ranch don't ever listen, or he don't ask no questions. Damn right he don't, said George, slightly mollified. Not if he wants to stay working long. But he was reassured by the swamper's defense. Come on in. And sit down a minute, he said. That's one hell of an old dog. Yeah, I had him ever since he was a pup. God, he was a good sheepdog when he was younger. He stood his broom against the wall and he rubbed his white bristled cheek with his knuckles. How'd you like the boss? He said. Pretty good. Seemed alright. Well, he's a nice fella, the swamper agreed. You gotta take him right. At that moment, a young man came into the bunkhouse. A thin young man with brown face, with brown eyes and a head of tightly curled hair. He wore a work glove on his left hand, and like the boss, he wore high-heeled boots. See my old man? He asked. The swamper said, he was just here a minute ago. Curly went over to the cookhouse, I think. I'm trying to catch him, said Curly. His eyes passed over the new men, and he stopped. He glanced coldly at George and then at Lenny. His arms gradually bent at the elbows and his hands closed in the fists. He stiffened and went into a slight crouch. His glance was at once calculating and pugnacious. That means fighter-like. Lenny squirmed under the look and shifted his feet nervously. Curly stepped gingerly close to him. You the new guys the old man was waiting for? Yeah, we just came in, said George. Let the big guy talk. Lenny twisted with embarrassment. George said, Suppose you don't want to talk. Curly lashed his body around. Well, by Christ, he's gonna talk when he's spoken to. What the hell are you getting into it for? Well, we travel together, said George coldly. Oh, so it's that way. George was tense and motionless. Yeah, it's that way. Lenny was looking helplessly to George for instructions. And you won't let the big guy talk, is that it? Or he can talk if he wants to tell you anything. He nodded slightly to Lenny. We just came in, said Lenny softly. Curly stared levelly at him. Well, next time you answer when you're spoken to. He turned toward the door and walked out, and his elbows were still bent out a little. George watched him out, and then he turned to the swamper. Say, what the hell's he got on his shoulder? Lenny didn't do nothing to him. The old man looked cautiously at the door and made sure no one was listening. Yeah, that's the boss's son. Curly's pretty handy. He done quite a bit in the ring. He's a lightweight, and he's handy. Well, let him be handy, said George. He don't want to take after Lenny. Lenny don't do nothing to him. What's he got against Lenny? The swamper considered. Well, I'll tell you what. Curly's a lot like the little guys. He hates big guys. He's all the time picking scraps with big guys. Kind of like he's mad at them because he ain't a big guy. You seen little guys like that, ain't you? Always scrappy. Sure, said George. I've seen plenty of tough little guys, but this Curly better not make no mistakes about Lenny. Lenny ain't a handy. But this Curly punt is gonna get hurt if he does mess around with Lenny. Well, Curly's pretty handy, Swamper said skeptically. Never did seem right to me. Suppose Curly jumps a big guy and licks him. Everyone says what a game guy Curly is. And suppose that he does the same thing and gets licked. Then everybody says the big guy ought to pick on someone his own size. And maybe then they gang up on the big guy. Never did seem right to me. Seemed like Curly ain't giving nobody a chance. George was watching the door. He said ominously, well, he better watch out for Lenny. Lenny ain't no fighter, but Lenny's strong and quick, and Lenny don't know no rules. He walked to the square table and sat down on one of the boxes. He gathered some of the cards together and shuffled them. The old man sat down another box. Don't tell Curly I said none of this. He'll slug me. He just don't give a damn. Won't even get canned till his old man's the boss. George cut the cards and began turning them over, looking at each one and throwing it into a pile. He said, this girl Curly sounds like a son of a bitch to me, and I don't like mean little guys. Seems to me he's gotten worse lately, said the swamper. He got married a couple of weeks ago. Wife lives over in the boss's house. Seems like Curly is cockier than ever since he got married. George grunted. Maybe he's just showing off for his wife. The swamper warmed to his gossip. You seen that glove? Yeah, I seen it. Well, it's full of Vaseline. Vaseline? The hell's that for? Well, I tell you, Curly says he's keeping his hands soft. Ah, that's a dirty thing to tell around, George said. The old man was reassured. He had drawn a derogatory statement from George. He felt safe now, and he spoke more confidently. Well, you see Curly's wife. George turned the cards again and cut out a solitary lay. Slowly and deliberately. Purdy? He asked casually. Yeah, Purdy, but... George studied his cards. But what? Well, she got the eye. Yeah? Married 2 weeks and got the eye? Maybe that's why Curly's pants is full of ants. Well, I seen her give Slim the eye. Slim's a jerk-line standard, hell of a nice fella. Slim don't need to wear no high-heeled boots on the grain team. I seen her give Slim the eye. Curly's never seen it. I seen her give Carlson the eye. George pretended a lack of interest. Looks like we was gonna have fun. The swamper stood up and from his box. Know what I think? George did not answer. Well, I think Curly's married a tart. He ain't the first, said George. There's plenty that done that. The old man moved toward the door and his ancient dog lifted his head and peered about, and then got painfully to his feet to follow. I gotta get to setting out the wash bins for the guys. The team will be in before long. You guys buck barley? Yeah. Well, you won't tell Curly nothing I said? Hell no. Well, you look her over, mister. You see if she ain't a tart. He stepped out the door into the brilliant sunshine. George had laid down the cards thoughtfully, turned his pile of threes, built 4 cards on his ace pile. The sun square was on the floor now. The flies whipped through it like sparks. A sound of jingling harnesses and the croak of heavy-laden axles sounded on the outside. From the distance came a clear call. Stable buck. Oh, stable buck. Oh, well, where the hell is that goddamned... George stared at his solitaire lay, and then he flounced the cards together and turned around to Lenny. Lenny was lying down in the bunt watching him. Look, Lenny. This here ain't no setup. I'm scared. You're gonna have trouble with that Curly guy. I seen that kind before. He was kind of feeling you out. He figures he's got you scared, and he's gonna take a sock at you the first chance that he gets. Lenny's eyes are frightened. Well, I don't want no trouble, he said plainly. Don't let him sock me, George. George got up and went over to Lenny's bunt and sat down on it. I hate that kind of bastard, he said. I've seen plenty of them. Like the old guy says, Curly don't take no chances. He always wins. He thought for a moment. If he tangles with you, Lenny, we're gonna get the tan. Don't make no mistake about it. He's the boss's son. So look, Lenny, you gotta keep away from him, will you? Don't never speak to him. If he comes in here, you move clear the other side of the room. Will you do that, Lenny? Well, I don't want no trouble, Lenny mourned. I never done nothing to him. Well, that won't do you no good if Curly wants to plug himself up for a fighter. Just don't have nothing to do with him. Will you remember? Sure, George. I ain't gonna say a word. The sound of the approaching grain teams was louder. Thud of big hooves on a hard ground, drag of brakes, and the jingle of traced chains. Men were calling back and forth from the teams. George, sitting on the bunt beside Lenny, frowned as he thought. Lenny asked timidly, You ain't mad, George? I ain't mad at you. Mad at this here Curly bastard. I hoped he was gonna get a little stake together, maybe $100. His tone grew decisive. You keep away from Curly, Lenny. Sure I will, George. I won't say a word. Don't let him pull you in. But if that son of a bitch socks you, you let him have it. Let him have what, George? Never mind. I'll tell you when. I hate that kind of guy. Look, Lenny, if you get in any trouble, you remember what I told you to do? Lenny raised up on his elbow, his face contorted with thought. Then his eyes moved slowly to George's face. If I get in any trouble, you ain't gonna let me tend the rabbits. That's not what I meant. You remember where we slept last night down by the river? Oh, yeah, I remember. Sure, I remember. I'd go there and hide in the brush. Hide till I come for you. Don't let anyone see you. Just hide in the brush by the river. Say that over. Hide in the brush by the river. Down in the brush by the river. If you get in any trouble, if I get in any trouble. A brake screeched outside. A call came. Stable buck. Oh, stable buck. George said, Say it over to yourself, Lenny, so you won't forget it. Both men glanced up, for the rectangle of sunshine in the doorway was cut off. A girl was standing there, looking in. She had full rouged lips and wide spaced eyes, heavily made up. Her fingernails were red. Her hair hung in little rolled clusters like sausages. She wore a cotton house dress and red mules, on the instep of which were little bouquets of red ostrich feathers. I'm looking for Curly, she said. Her voice had a nasal, brittle quality. George looked away from her and then back. He had been here a minute ago, but he went. Oh. She put her hands behind her back and leaned against the door frame so that her body was thrown forward. You're the new fellas that just come, ain't you? Yeah. Lenny's eyes moved down over her body, and though she did not seem to be looking at Lenny, she bridled a little. She looked at her fingernails. Sometimes Curly's in here, she explained. George said brusquely, Well, he ain't now. Well, if he ain't, I guess I better look someplace else, she said playfully. Lenny watched her, fascinated. George said, Well, if I see him, I'll pass the word you was looking for him. She smiled archly and twisted her body. Nobody can blame a person for looking, she said, and there were some footsteps behind her, going by. She turned her head. Hi, Slim, she said. Slim's voice came through the door. Hey, good looking. I'm just trying to find Curly, Slim. Well, you ain't trying very hard. I seen him going into your house. She was suddenly apprehensive. Bye, boys. She called into the bunkhouse and she hurried away. George looked around at Lenny. Jesus, what a tramp, he said. So that's what Curly pits for a wife. Oh, she's purty, said Lenny defensively. And she's sure hiding it. Curly's got his work out ahead of him. I bet she'd clear out for $20. Lenny still stared at the doorway where she had been. Gosh, she was purty. He smiled admiringly. George looked quickly down at him, and then he took him by the ear and shook him. Listen to me, you crazy bastard, he said fiercely. Don't you ever take a look at that bitch. I don't care what she says or what she does. I seen them poisoned before. But I ain't never seen no piece of jailbait worse than her. You leave her be. Lenny tried to disengage his ear. I never done nothing, George. No, you never. But when she was standing in that doorway showing her legs, you wasn't looking the other way, neither. And I never meant no harm, George. Honest, I never. Well, you keep away from her. 'Cause she's a rat trap if I've ever seen one. You let Curly take that rap. He gets himself in for it. And I bet he's eating raw eggs and writing out the patient medicine houses. Ugh. George cried out suddenly. Well, I don't like this place, George. It ain't a good place. I don't want to be here. Well, we gotta keep it till we got a steak. We can't help it, Lenny. We'll just get out. We'll get out just as soon as we can. I don't like it no better than you do. He went back to the table and set out a new solitaire hand. No, I don't like it. For 2 bits, I'd shove out of here. If we could just get a few dollars in the poke, we'll shove off. And we'll go off to the American River and pan gold. We can maybe make a couple $100 a day out there. Yeah, we might even hit a pocket. Really towards him. Let's go, George. Let's get out of here. It's mean here. We gotta stay. George said shortly. Shut up now, the guys will be coming in. From the washroom nearby came the sound of running water and rattling basins. George studied the cards. Maybe we ought to wash up, he said. But we ain't done nothing to get dirty. A tall man stood in the doorway. He held a crushed Stetson hat under his arm, while he combed his long, black, damp hair straight back. Like the others, he wore blue jeans and a short denim jacket. When he had finished combing his hair, he moved into the room. He moved with a majesty only achieved by royalty and master craftsmen. He was a jerkline skinner, the prince of the ranch, capable of rounding 10, 16, even 20 mules with a single line to the leaders. He was capable of killing a fly on a wheeler's butt with a bullwhip without touching the mule. There was a gravity in his manner and a quiet so profound that all talk stopped when he spoke. His authority was so great that his word was taken on any subject, be it politics or love. This was Slim, the jerkline skinner. His hatchet face was ageless. He might have been 35 or 50. His ear heard more than was said to him, and his slow speech had overtones not of thought, but of understanding beyond thought. His hands, large and lean, were as delicate in their action as those of a temple dancer. He smoothed out his crushed hat, creased it in the middle, and put it back on. He looked kindly at the two in the bunkhouse. It's brighter than a bitch outside, he said gently. Can't hardly see nothing in here. You the new guys? Yeah, we just come, said George. Got a butt barley? Well, that's what the boss says. Slim sat down with a box across the table from George. He studied the solitaire hand that was upside down. To him. Hope you get on my team, he said. His voice was very gentle. I got a pair of punts on my team that don't know a barley bag from blue ball. You guys ever butted any barley? Hell yes, said George. I ain't nothing to scream about, but that big bastard there can pick up more grain than most pears can. Lenny, who had been following the conversation back and forth with his eyes, smiled complacently at the compliment. Slim looked approvingly at George for having given the compliment. He leaned over to the table and snapped the corner of a loose card. You guys travel around together? His tone was friendly. It invited confidence without demanding it. Sure, said George. We kind of look after each other. He indicated Lenny with his thumb. He ain't bright. Hell of a good worker, though. Hell of a nice fella, but he ain't bright. Known him for a long time. Slim looked at George and beyond him. Many guys travel around together. I don't know why. Maybe everybody in the whole damn world's scared of each other. It's a lot nicer to go around with a guy you know, said George. A powerful, big-stomached man came into the bunkhouse. His head was still dripping wet from the scrubbing and dousing. "Ha, Slim," he said, and then stopped and stared at George and Lenny. Well, these here guys just come, said Slim by way of introduction. Oh, glad to meet you, the big man said. My name's Carlson. Well, I'm George Milton, and this here's Lenny Small. Glad to meet you, Carlson said again. He ain't very small. Ain't small at all. I meant to ask you, Slim. How's your bitch? I seen she's been under the wagon this morning. Oh, she sunned the pups last night, said Slim. 9 of them. Drowned 4 of them right off. She couldn't feed that many. Slim's dog. Just making sure that if you're freaking out, Slim's dog. Got 5 left, huh? Yeah, 5. Kept the biggest. What kind of dogs do you think they're gonna be? I don't know. Some kind of shepherds? I guess. That's the most kind I've seen around here when she was in heat. Carlson went on. Got 5 pups, huh? Gonna keep all of them? I don't know. Keep them a while so they can drink Lulu's milk. Carlson said thoughtfully, Well, look at here, Slim. I've been thinking, that dog at Candy's is as goddamn old as he can hardly walk, stinks like hell. Every time he comes into the bunkhouse, I can smell him for 2-3 days. Why don't you get Candy to shoot his old dog and give him one of them new pups to raise up? I can smell that dog a mile away. Got no teeth, damn near blind, can't eat. Candy feeds him milk, can't chew nothing else. George had been staring intently at Slim. Suddenly, a triangle began to ring outside, slowly at first, then faster and faster until the beat of it disappeared into one ringing sound. It stopped as suddenly as it had started. Well, there she goes, said Carlson. Outside, there was a burst of voices as a group of men went by. Slim stood up slowly and with dignity. You guys better come while there's still something to eat. Won't be nothing left in a couple of minutes. Carlson stepped back and to let Slim precede him, and the 2 of them went out the door. Lenny was watching George excitedly. George rumpled his cards into a messy pile. Yeah, I heard him, Lenny. I'll ask him. A brown and white one, Jenny cried excitedly. Oh, come on. Let's get dinner. I don't know whether he's got a brown and white one. Lenny didn't move from his bunk. You asked him about Ray, George, so he won't kill no more of them? Sure. Come on now. Get up on your feet. Lenny rolled off his bunk and stood up, and the 2 of them started for the door. Just as they reached out, Curly bounced in. You seen a girl around here? He demanded angrily. George said coldly, About half an hour ago, maybe. Well, what the hell was she doing? George stood still, looking at the angry little man. He said insultingly, She said she was looking for you. Curly seemed really to see George for the first time. His eyes flashed over George, took in his height, measured his reach, looked at his trim middle. Yeah, well, which way did she go? He demanded at last. I don't know. I didn't watch her go. Curly scowled at him, and turning, hurried out the door. George said, You know, Lenny, I'm scared I'm going to tangle with that bastard myself. I hate his guts. Jesus Christ. Come on. There won't be a damn thing left to eat. They went out the door. The sunshine lay in a thin line under the window. From a distance, there could be heard a rattle of dishes. After a moment, the ancient dog walked lamely on through the open door. He gazed about with mild, half-blind eyes. He sniffed, and then lay down and put his head between his paws. Curly popped into the doorway again, and stood there looking into the room. The dog raised his head, but when Curly jerked out, the grizzled head sank to the floor again. That was Chapter 2 of Mice and Men. Longer than the last one. I'm going to continue to read this book throughout the entire time, so if you are somehow not in my class and listening, and you like how I'm reading, feel free to follow along. Bye.